Hello everybody, welcome to the County Seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. Today we are talking about one of the two things that's perennial, and we are not discussing death, we are discussing taxes. And taxes have been on the lips of legislators now for an entire year. There's some good reason for it, and to look at the tax predicament Utah's found itself in, a little history lesson is in order. So on to our history teacher, Derek Dowsett.
Not alone in the United States, but all over the civilized world, the question of taxation is the big problem.
This was the sentiment of Utah's fourth governor of Utah, and here we are nearly 100 years later, and the question of taxation is still a big problem. In 1920, the state had a large budget deficit. Today, there is a surplus, but legislators are trying to make sure revenue for the budget keeps pace with a growing population. Deficit or surplus, there is a balancing act of how best to levy the taxes required to provide services that we often take for granted. So, what makes good tax policy?
Oftentimes for many folks, it's a tax that's not on me, but it's on somebody else. Okay, but really when it comes to theoretical, it's how do you lower the rate and broaden the base so that everybody has a little bit of burden, and that burden's not too great on any one individual or organization. That's why tax practitioners say, in theory, taxing final consumption is the appropriate thing, because you're taxing it at the final point right before it's consumed. And so you want to have as broad a base and as low a rate when it comes to final consumption, which is great in theory. In practice, that's much more difficult.
The property tax was the primary revenue source for the state up until the Great Depression. The revenue to run state government disappeared as property values plummeted and people lost their homes. The legislature at the time determined they needed additional sources of revenue to keep government services intact. As a result, the state income tax was created in 1931, followed by the sales tax in 1933, creating what has been referred to as the three-legged stool of tax revenue in Utah. Later, in 1946, voters approved earmarking 100% of the income tax for education, and in 1996, that revenue source was opened up to higher education. The challenge for tax reform in 2019 is that the problems legislators are trying to solve aren't as apparent as they may have been during tax reforms of the past.
The key thing is, one, they don't have a revenue problem. The taxes are generating sufficient revenue, but from their perspective, they have an allocation problem. Revenues in certain buckets that can only be used for certain purposes and not in other buckets. So they'll talk about the income tax that has to go to education is generating sufficient funds, but their concern is the sales tax is getting squeezed. When it comes to the demand for services, whether it's expanding Medicaid and other things like that that the public expects, or when it comes to the weakening gas tax, so the sales tax is picking up more and more transportation funding, they're feeling like they don't have enough revenue in the sales tax bucket, what we call the general fund, relative to the income tax bucket and other sources.
Which is different from the last time the legislature discussed tax reform back in 2005.
Governor Oline Walker had already issued a report about concerns she had with various tax policies, including the income tax. One of her key concerns was our top rate at 7% was way too high. We could all rally around. We've got to get that rate down. We've got to be competitive. And I think that was one of the things that helped with the tax reform process. Clearly, it was a very long process, took many years. We finally passed it in 2007. And it passed unanimously in the House and Senate.
That unanimous support for tax reform creates predictability.
So one of the reasons that that's important is because capital has never been more mobile, people have never been more mobile, businesses have never been more mobile. And so money goes to where it's rewarded and it flees where it's punished. So if you have bad tax policy, money starts fleeing your state for other locations. And we've seen that in various states across the nation. We think Utah had good tax policy, and that's why we've seen such an influx of business to Utah, and we have one of the strongest economies in the nation.
It is likely that the questions involving tax policy will never have a simple answer, but hopefully an understanding of how we got to where we are today will cue us up for a better conversation about taxation.
Thanks, Derek. By the way, when's the test? Anyway, we will continue our conversation with Lincoln Schurz from the Utah Association of Counties on taxes. When we return on the County Seat, we'll be back after this break. Welcome back to the county seat. We are talking about tax reform. It has probably been the most discussed topic since House Bill 441 showed up last year in the legislature. It has consumed most of the oxygen in the room in all of the interim meetings of the legislature. Joining us to bring some perspective to it all is Lincoln Schertz, the steadfast governmental representative for the Utah Association of Counties. Lincoln, thanks for taking some time to talk to us about this today.
Thanks, Chad. Happy to be here.
When 441 came up, it was kind of like full panic mode for a whole bunch of people, and we did a show on it, and
Absolutely.
a lot of conversation. From what that bill looked like to where we are in tax reform with all these public hearings, what's changed?
Well, a couple of things. Starting at 441, I think the most important thing to understand is you have the legislature and several business groups who are looking at the way in which Utah silos revenue. What I don't think happened very well just based on timing of the 2019 legislative session was really explaining to the public what the true issue was. And the issue is not generating more money for the state of Utah. The issue is how do we generate money and how are we siloing the money? How are we spending the money in these very specific silos, some which are by constitutional mandate and other are by bonding obligations. And so really what the legislature is in a process of doing is figuring out where those silos exist in ways in which they can break down those silos so that there's more flexibility for policymakers to be responsive to the public in terms of what the needs of the state of Utah are. As we look into the future of Utah, obviously growth is a significant issue, and with growth we have a couple different pressure points. One, obviously affordable housing and housing for workforce development that we're seeing in the state of Utah, transportation infrastructure and general infrastructure, whether it be water infrastructure, transit, or transportation, and then in addition education. So again, as you look at these pressure points, I think the legislature is truly trying to find a way in which they can address fungibility of revenue, making sure that they have the ability to move money where the pressure points are, whereas right now there are these constitutional and regulatory kind of strangleholds that keep them siloed in different categories.
And that's an interesting point, because I'm really only aware of the constitutional restriction on the income tax being dedicated to education.
Correct.
And that therein lies one of the problems. Are there other funds of those other buckets of money that have restrictions on them?
There are. So the others are statutory. The only constitutional is the earmark for education, where all of our income tax goes to education. Obviously the most significant. It's 50% of the state budget is earmarked for education through the income tax. However, over the last 5 or 6 years, the legislature, through policy and through statute, has come in and also said we're going to take a portion of the sales tax. Roughly 24% of all sales tax dollars generated are statutorily earmarked for transportation infrastructure in the state of Utah. Recognizing the growth that we're seeing, we've taken the sales tax that's equivalent to how much we spend on auto-related sales, whether that be parts or actual automobiles, and have earmarked that for transportation projects. Well, that's an earmark, if you will, on the general fund. So one, we have an earmark on the education fund, then we have an earmark on the general fund. Those are significant earmarks. It's billions of dollars in the education fund. It's it's over $500 million. It's about $650 million a year that's earmarked for transportation in the general fund as well, through sales tax earmarks coming into the state.
Have they narrowed down exactly what it is they're trying to accomplish with this?
On the education side, what they're truly seeing is immense growth. We have the lowest unemployment in the country, immense growth in the education fund. And then in the general fund, they're not seeing as much growth, in large part due to the earmark on transportation projects that I just described. And so what I think the legislature in part is trying to do is say, let's remove the sales tax earmark on transportation projects and instead come up with user fees to pay for those transportation projects. So what you're going to be seeing in the special session coming up on December 12th is really this opportunity where they're going to say, we're going to remove these general fund earmarks and in exchange put a tax on gasoline. They're going to increase the excise tax on diesel fuel by 10 cents. But the idea, the logic at the broader policy level is, shouldn't we use user fees, i.e. the gas tax and the diesel tax, to pay for roads and free up money that's otherwise restricted to use for other general fund needs like corrections, public safety, health and human services, Medicaid, etc. But the offset will be in the income tax. So if you look at a typical Utah family of four making $60,000, $65,000 a year, it will actually be a tax cut. You're going to see the tax cut on the income tax side and some dedicated tax credits that you'll receive if you're low income. Those tax credits will be for child deductions. They're going to increase the child deduction tax credit, and they're going to include a tax credit for food-related purchases as well for the low income.
On a poverty, quote, poverty level, low income level
Correct, and
threshold.
it will be staged based on what level of poverty you find yourself in. Right. So there are going to be some tax cuts, but simultaneously there are going to be some increases in taxes on these user fees that I just described.
I think we'll take a break here.
Sure.
I'll come back with a question, and we'll just kind of wander into where this whole program looks and what some of the alarm bells are for counties, both urban and rural. On
Absolutely.
All right, we'll be right back on the County Seat, our conversation with Lincoln Schertz. Welcome back to the County Seat. We are talking today about the tax initiative, the tax reform task force that's been meeting. Wouldn't it just be simpler to just get rid of all those little dedicated funds, take out the constitutional amendment on education, and just say, okay, this is how much money we got, this is how we're going to divide it up? Wouldn't that be easier?
If politics was easy, I wouldn't have a job. You know, there are some issues that they have to address in some of this. Let me compare to 441, first and foremost, because I think some people still believe that we're really looking at taxing a whole bunch of new services. For the most part, now this isn't universal, but for the most part, the legislature has walked away from taxing a whole host of new services. They have talked about taxing certain services that I think there's a logical nexus. You used to pay taxes, we've changed the way in which we deliver those types of services, we should probably tax those types of services. But in terms of the broad expansion of services, for the most part, the legislature has walked away and instead said, let's raise some user fees specific to different types of services that are being provided by government, i.e. the gas tax and the diesel fuel tax. Those will be increased. But in terms of the broad expansion of the tax base to include a whole host of new services, most of that's gone. Go ahead.
Do you think that the tax offset in income tax with the reduced rate will be sufficient enough for the average family who drives 15,000, 20,000 miles a year to cover the cost of that tax increase on the user fee side?
So in total, when you look at what they're increasing in revenue, and again, this is in the aggregate, so each family will be a little different. In total, it will be between $80 and $100 million in tax cuts in the state of Utah. So it will definitely be a tax cut. The question is where do you fit on the income spectrum and where do you fit on the user fee spectrum? There is a scenario that I'm sure exists where you don't make a lot of money, but you drive a lot of miles. You'll probably be paying a little bit more in taxes. However, for the average family, as we've looked at what the average person drives and what the average person makes and what the average family looks like in Utah, it will be about a $400 to $500 tax cut every single year.
And you said in the long term, the constitutional restriction on education is going to come off income tax to allow?
That's the goal. Legislative leadership is certainly working. I think that's one of the hallmarks of what they're trying to do with tax reform is say, let's get rid of this earmark and give us more flexibility on how we spend the income tax. The education lobby is a significant lobby, and they have held very strongly onto that constitutional earmark of income tax, recognizing it guarantees a certain revenue source. Now, there's an argument on both sides of that equation, right? You would also argue we're almost last in the nation on education spending, so how much is the earmark really doing for us? That's one argument. The other is, well, if we get rid of it, does that just mean that the legislature is going to come in and cut more out of education spending? That's yet to be determined.
There have been years where I hear there's a $200 million surplus in state tax revenue, and we're still crying for money on essential services.
Most of the surpluses, even on the income tax side, have been what they call one-time surpluses, meaning that you can't build programs with those dollars, but you can have one-time expenditures. The net benefactor of that has primarily been higher education and public education in the context of we've built a lot of buildings to support those facilities. You know, if you look at the University of Utah, when I went to school there, it looks like a very different campus today than it did when I went to school.
I can't even navigate it.
And in part, that's because we've had such significant one-time money in the education fund that can go towards those type of expenditures that we've ended up spending the money on that. And what the legislature is saying is, maybe that isn't the highest priority. If we had more flexibility, we would take some of those one-time dollars and put it into double tracking the TRAX line in Salt Lake and Davis and Weber County to allow for more transit options. There's a whole host of things that they would like to see more flexibility on how they spend those dollars versus having it so earmarked that it can only be used for very specific purposes.
What do you see is the biggest impact to urban counties?
To not get too nuanced into some of this, the sales tax is more complicated than probably most people appreciate. It's not a single rate statewide. The state imposes a sales tax, counties impose a sales tax, UTA imposes a sales tax, cities impose a sales tax. So it's this composition of rates. When the state is saying they're going to increase the sales tax on food, they are only talking about the state rate, which is 4.85%. And all they're doing is reinstating the sales tax up to the 4.85%. They are not going to include the transit options, the city options, or the county options. So from that standpoint, not a huge net benefit to cities and counties in their actual general fund, but certainly it's going to go to promote projects that are important to local government, like transportation and water development projects. So yes, we will be net benefactors of that potential new flexibility, but in terms of our bottom line, not a lot of new growth, if you will, in tax dollars, because they're not including us in that base expansion on sales tax on food or sales tax on fuel.
So originally in 441, they were talking about reducing some of the sales tax on goods and then increasing it on services.
So in terms of tax policy, one of the kind of well-held standards of great tax policy is you should have a very broad base and a low rate. What they were contemplating in 441 was lowering the rate significantly and broadening the base significantly. What they soon realized, because of that, if you will, convoluted sales tax structure, what they came back and said, this is way too complicated. Let's just focus on the state rate, and the locals, we'll come back and deal with them when it's not tied to what the state's trying to do, just because of the complexity of trying to figure out how you manage 250 city rates and 29 county rates in addition to the state rate.
So as it's proposed right now, as far as generation of sales tax on a local level, aside from the fact that the raised state rate might affect some people purchasing a portion, it's neutral. It doesn't raise it, it doesn't lower it. They're pretty constant.
Correct. One thing that is being discussed, and this isn't on the sales tax side, this is on the property tax side, it's a bit of a trade-off for getting rid of the constitutional earmark, is allowing school districts to go through and have a COLA adjustment, a CPI adjustment to the property tax without going through truth and taxation. So kind of one of the trade-offs they're talking about is, sure, we're going to lower income tax, sure, we're going to take the constitutional earmark off of income tax, but education community, what we're going to give you is the opportunity to increase property tax on a year-over-year basis, less than inflation, without going through truth and taxation.
So how are the special service districts in the counties going to feel about the fact that the biggest chunk of their property tax bill that the county takes all the heat for is now out of truth and taxation, and the counties and special service districts still are?
Well, then let me nuance this. They're not out of truth and taxation. They're only out if it's only going up by inflation. So in essence, you can do a very modest rate increase, lower than CPI. And if you do that, then no truth in taxation, or a modified truth in taxation light, we'll call it.
Is there any possibility that that would roll over into the county and special service districts as well?
We are having that conversation at this point, where the legislature is hypersensitive to ensuring that they're doing a property tax cut in the aggregate. It becomes very difficult when you include 250 cities and 29 counties, and also allowing them to have a rate increase. So at this point, there doesn't seem to be much legislative appetite in that area, but we are certainly having that conversation.
Excellent. Well, I want to take a look at the legislative perspective. We'll tackle that one when we come back.
Excellent.
You're watching The County Seat. Welcome back to The County Seat. We're talking with Lincoln Schertz from the Utah Association of Counties, trying to get our heads around the tax reform, which is going to reach some kind of consensus here in the next few days, if not few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've kind of looked at the county's take on it. What kind of impacts is this going to be for the legislature?
And I don't want to say tax reform is generational. The last tax reform we did was during the Huntsman administration back in 2004, 2005, implemented in 2006. So it has roughly been 13 years since the last tax reform. These are generational changes. It is definitely going to change the incentive structure behind how people purchase things. There is some concern from local government that we are going to be left behind in terms of this base expansion as we face a new economy. I think everyone can acknowledge the way in which we buy goods is fundamentally changing. And if we get left behind in that process, it will be difficult to catch back up. So there is some concern that it is a dangerous precedent that the legislature is setting with local government. At the same token, they have been committed to us to not hurt local government in their tax reform efforts, and I applaud them because they have not. Everything they have done has been, at best, revenue neutral, and in many circumstances certainly will be helping with projects that we have a mutual interest in.
So how would a county get left behind? I mean, because mostly income tax isn't their thing. It's property tax and sales tax.
So we have always partnered with the state on sales tax, meaning that the base is the same regardless. We don't bifurcate the base for the state and local. So that's a new trend. And what does that mean as we continue to look at future base expansions? Are they also going to be looking at leaving local governments behind on future base expansions? The other place in which we've always participated is in motor fuel taxes and this new iteration, which is going to be sales tax on fuel. We have always had a portion of those dollars come to local governments for local government maintenance and operation needs for our roads and transit projects. That's not necessarily the case in this proposal. And again, generally speaking, what does that mean for local government who will still have an obligation to address growth in their communities and make sure that they're prepared to invest in and maintain the infrastructure in your hometown?
So do you think that we'll possibly find ourselves in the same situation we were in back when they just did the fuel tax adjustment a couple of years ago, and then they had to turn around and fix it because the B&C funds?
I think at some point down the road there will be an acknowledgement that they're going to have to allow local governments to also have more flexibility on imposing new taxes or bring them into the base that they're contemplating expanding to today. When that occurs, who knows? Oftentimes legislatures are inherently reactive, which means they're going to wait until the pressure exists, and then we start addressing those problems. The question is, how soon does the pressure approach on local government?
One last question. Do you see, as it's stacked up right now, counties advance ahead or they get pushed off?
I would say we're ahead in that there will be projects that are certainly important to us that I believe get funded out of this effort.
Excellent. Thank you for taking the time, Lincoln. Thank you for joining us on the County Seat, and I invite you to go to our County Seat webpage, go to our County Seat Facebook page, follow us on YouTube. We love your comments. Follow us on Twitter and get engaged in the conversation. Love to hear your comments. We'll see you next week on the County Seat.